sort of against this normative reading of history where all that's going on are sort of like the movements and maneuvers and growth and contractions of these various kingdoms and empires, we can ask, did everyone belong to a state, or was everybody subject to a state?
This episode is the contribution to SuTuPyu Podcast series hosted by Radio Myanmar. The series aims to share or disseminate the scholarly knowledge of social science and humanities research in the context of Burma to the broader audience in accessible language. In this episode, we will have a conversation about Zomia as a form of refuge. So the Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify links can be found under this video. Please leave comments on your thoughts about the matter that we discussed today. My name is Ithenza. I am a postdoctorate scholar at Chiang Mai University and Cambridge University.
My name is Brendan Flanagan. I am an anthropologist and a builder. I'm currently working on my PhD through the University of Hawaii-Manoa.
So we will have a conversation about Zomia. If we are going to talk about Zomia, it's always James Scott, right? From the James Scott's book, I will just read from the book, The Art of Not Being Governed. In his preface, he provides a thesis of the term Zomia, saying that Zomia is the largest remaining region of the world whose peoples have not yet been fully incorporated into the nation state. So that's his statement. Can you elaborate what Zomia is?
Well, I think it might be helpful for the listener for what he's referring to geographically. Geographically, sort of Zomia correlates with what we call the Southeast Asian Massif. So this is an upland region stretching from what is now sort of northwest India across into southern China, and then sort of dropping down into Southeast Asia. So this is sort of the geographic parameters of the area that Zomia refers to in Scott's book. So I think the next step then would be to discuss who lives in Zomia, right?
Before we go to the who, right, can you just elaborate more about what is Zomia, the term itself?
Right. So I think it's good to give credit where credit's due. So Scott sort of popularizes the term in this book. He took the term from a Dutch historian, Wilhelm von Schendel, who coined this term Zomia. Now, this term Zomia derives etymologically from the term Zo, which refers to a particular ethnic group in the highlands of Chinland. And sort of that's where he built the term from, and then Scott builds out that term. So I think that gives us a clue that the term sort of emerges both sort of geographically and etymologically from this uplands area.
So then, move to the who lives in Zomia, the historical Zomia of Scots.
Right. So, like I just referred to, we have this one group, the Zo, but that's just one of many. So Zomia sort of refers to an extremely diverse, extremely heterogeneous ethnic mosaic. So you have all these different groups: Kayin, Hmong, Na, Naga, Kachin, etc. Almost an infinite number of groups that would be far too long of a list to go into here.
So they live in that uplands area, and
right.
Why
so
did
this
they live
this
there?
is, I think, the interesting part, right? Why do these people choose to inhabit this area? So, sort of, the point of the book is to point out that people chose to live here, right? People chose to live here as a means of escaping direct control by the state. So they were escaping the sort of central forces of the state. They were escaping taxation. They were escaping conscription into the king's army. They were escaping being enrolled into the labor regimes of the lowland rice-growing empires of Southeast Asia. And they were trying to create sort of zones of freedom, new forms of living outside of the reach of the state. And the mountains, the rugged terrain, provided the opportunity to do this.
So that I got to learn, like, who lived in Zomia, why they lived. But I also took Southeast Asian history when I did my PhD. The history always, like, the narrative that we had to read was like of like Anthony Reed's or Victor Lieberman, who talks more about like the classical states, people under the kings. And until I read this book, I didn't recognize that people lived outside the kingdoms. So was everyone the subjects of the kings at that time? How are we going to construct like these two narratives?
Right, so that's a great point, and I think that gets to one of the central aspects of the book. It's sort of against this normative reading of history where all that's going on are sort of like the movements and maneuvers and growth and contractions of these various kingdoms and empires. We can ask, did everyone belong to a state, or was everybody subject to a state? And what the theses in Zomia in the book is basically arguing that no, not everyone was a subject of the state, and in fact, they were deliberately trying not to be. They were deliberately avoiding being part of the state. And what we see, instead of simply the sort of classic example of the mandala, sort of this, the center of the state, sort of its power, sort of concentrically spilling outwards, both materially, practically, symbolically. What Zomia shows is sort of the edges, where that mandala starts to break apart, and sort of different interstices of inhabitation where people are existing outside of those forms of control.
So like the two things, right? Like what I was reading is more of mandala, but Scott was talking about the ages of mandala, the Zomia, where they started forming into out of the state.
Right. So he calls it the shatter zone, right? And I think we can think in terms of sort of a antagonistic reciprocity between the lowland centers, the mandala, and Zomia. Sort of there's lots of interaction between these zones, lots of cultural interchange, material interchange, movement of goods, movement of ideas, and movement of peoples, right? So people are escaping from the state. But also the state is going out into these zones to capture people to use as slaves or conscripts in the army.
There is like one thing I'm very interested in when I read that book, because my research my PhD research was about identities and how the role of language in identity making. So one stream of literature always talk about language as the accents of identity, like strongly saying that language is the umbilical cord of the identity, like some language rights scholar essentialist point of view. But when I read Scott's book, what I noticed is that he explained there were like two accounts of the history of language, the history of literacy. One is the standard civilization account, like Burmese or Mon, who already had the written history, like Mahayazawin Ji, Yazawin La, Yazawin The, things like that. And the other one is of those with lost language. For example, like Lahu or Kayin, like that. And he shows some like folklore stories that also I actually interview people on the ground. They have very similar story like that. Some folklore is saying the carelessness of the elders, the old people, like how they lost the language because they left the book outside and the chicken take it or the animal took it, or
Right.
there was the way story about like they left the language and the cows ate it or things like that. That is like one thing that Scott also showed, the carelessness. Because of the carelessness they lost the language. And then the other part is the treachery of the states. Like there are stories about like how Burmese kings cut off hands for these ethnic, for these let's say Kayen. That's what I know, like what I did research on, right? So they cut off the hands so that there is no Kayen written language. So Scott was saying that in the book, these two narration, one is that standardized one, the civilization language history. Another one is the language loss history. So he was claiming that these two things, like talking about carelessness or treachery, it is like, because they feel it is the stigmatization for them. It's the stigma that they don't have written language and literacy. So they kind of like these folklore and these story help them to understand why they lost the language. One, they try to enact it back to their identity, their accents, the essentializing
Right.
their identity in the language. So I wonder, like when you read, like how did you interpret like this particular part about the language from Scott's in Zomia
Well,
context?
I think Scott talks. You very well described what Scott talks about. But one of the sort of provocative moves he makes there, is he tries to argue sort of for sort of a positive virtue of the loss of language, sort of a refusal of language, and he argues that sort of the people who are escaping the state recognize language as a technology of the state. So instead of seeing this language, the loss of written language, as sort of some sort of loss or reversion to an earlier sort of pre-civilized state, what Scott's trying to argue for is the recognition that abandoning written language can be sort of a deliberate strategy of escape.
Yeah, I noticed like he used the term. He said he prefer non-literacy or orality over
right.
illiteracy, like carrying their cultural lives and tradition through like oral history instead of using the language. And language was to communicate, right? There is no essential identity and groups attached.
Right. Once again, we see these very fluid boundaries between communities in terms of which language people would be using with their neighbors, right? So it's not a matter of a one-to-one correlation between an ethnic identity and a codified language. Many of these groups would be multilingual, and sort of especially at the boundaries of communities. And it would be hard to define who someone was based on what language they were speaking.
Yeah, I mean that's always that left me with the question that, and then in that context, what is the mother tongue? What is the mother tongue at that
Right.
point? Thanks for engaging with our conversation about the Zomia as a form of refuge. And the Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify links can be found under the video. Please leave the comments on your thoughts about the matter that we discussed. We discussed about Zomia, the historical Zomia from the James Scott's book, what the term is, who lived there, where is it, and then the bonus is the language part of the Zomia. So in the second part, we are going to discuss about the new Zomia,